The content presented in this podcast and YouTube show is for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the guidance of your physician or other qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding your health or a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this show. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or emergency services immediately. The host, guests, and producers of this show are not responsible for any adverse effects resulting from your use of or reliance on any information presented.
Andrea, can you hear us?
Many years ago, I died for 26 seconds. There are so many people in this world that have experienced life events that have led to their sole purpose. Wake Up Your Soul with Andrea will bring you these significant life events that demonstrate how to use those moments for guidance and life purpose. These are our stories. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Wake Up Your Soul with Andrea Lynn. Today's guest has been out in this world protecting everyone at the expense of his mental health. And today he's going to share with us how he came to a mental break and how he fixed himself. Let's welcome Evan. Hi, Evan.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm great. How are you?
I'm good.
I would love for you to tell the audience real briefly about your childhood and, what your mental state was just as a child. What was life like?
So I grew up in Central Illinois. There's really not anything special about it. I grew up in a small farm town to a loving mom and a dad. There wasn't anything in particular. I don't have a long history of policing in my background and my family or anything like that. My father was a gas man. He worked 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., so he wasn't home a lot. I didn't see him a lot. My mom worked a very professional job as a nuclear med tech. I did all the things, T-ball and all that kind of stuff growing up as a kid. It really wasn't anything extravagant for the most part. I just went to grade school, middle school, high school, then I graduated.
What led you into your career and what was your career for those listening?
So I have been a police officer for 22 years, and I think I had some exposure early on. There was a guy in our church that was an undercover cop that I kind of got to know pretty well. He had ended up passing away eventually from cancer, but I had just been around several different things and such. And I think that it's just one of those things too, a lot of times, and I see it in young cops too nowadays, or interns or things of that nature. It's just one of those callings. I feel like you're just called to do. It's one of those things these people always, usually that our police officers say, this is pretty much what I've always wanted to do. And I think that I'm just one of those type of people too.
Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. I totally get that. There's always something, deep in our souls where we just gravitate towards something. So I totally understand that. So you go into policing, and what was this career like?
So it was actually really difficult. It's far different than what it is now as far as like the applicant procedure comes. I had something against me early on because I didn't have a college degree. I wasn't a minority and I didn't have military in my background. All those people would get preference points when you would try to get hired.
Okay.
So they would always be shot up higher up on the list. And it was incredibly hard for me to get hired as a police officer. I would test and test and test, and I could never get hired. So eventually what I had to do is I went the correctional route. I first started out with the state, but then eventually I would land in here in McLean County in Bloomington, Illinois, in Central Illinois, where I would work as a correctional officer. And little did I know how important this would actually be in my life, because as we talked about a little bit ago, I have this crazy superpower. I don't know how I got it, but I have a photographic memory for names and faces. So while I worked at the jail, I was building this incredible Rolodex of people who are going to be operating, or, I mean, everybody changes, not that everybody that gets out is going to reoffend or anything like that, but I had this huge database of knowledge and people. So eventually Normal would hire, that's where I work at here in Central Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
And I would get hired on, and I could do these wild things. I could drive around and I could say, hey, there's so-and-so, or there's so-and-so, or I know that person or this person. So I started really quickly making great traffic stops, great arrests, and I was seizing guns and drugs and gangs, which would ultimately cement the pathway of my career at that point early on.
Wow. Okay, so I do want to point out something that I want you to keep going with your story, but I want to point out the fact that you had like so much dedication to getting the job you wanted and you dreamed of, because you're saying like it was so hard to get it, but it's like, okay, I can't get it this way. Let me find another way. So then you went into corrections. And I think that's really important for some people to hear, because I feel like often people will give up too quickly on a hope or a dream. So I just wanted to point that out. But go ahead
Yeah,
and start telling us about once you got into the policing and what happened. You knew names and faces pretty well, right? Since you had this
correct.
photographic memory. And so what did that lead you to doing?
It just allowed me to be able to make very high profile traffic stops early. A lot of people just have to operate on a blind sense or a hunch or things of that nature, where I had actual real time knowledge of who these
Okay.
people are, where they were, who they hung out with, what they were involved in. And it was really easy for me at that point to make these traffic stops. And I think one of the things I would learn later on in life was that I didn't get, and it's nothing against like growing up, but I was getting so much affirmation. Like I said, my dad wasn't around a whole lot. I mean, that's just the way it was. But I was getting so much affirmation from these people that I didn't really get from like him, and I didn't realize how important that was. And I think that helped me gravitate and push me forward. And it was one of those driving factors, because everybody likes it when you get that kind of affirmation. But it was for doing these dangerous things as a young police officer. But it also shaped my path, like I said, too, because as I continued to make these stops, eventually I was repurposed for my first time. We have acronyms, but it'll just be easier to call it. It's essentially like our gang unit was where I got placed.
Okay.
And then I would make my way to the SWAT team as well. Ours is not full time, so it's a part time SWAT team. But essentially, though, it would just excel my career being able to navigate this path and having all this knowledge. But having these in my way towards specialties like these here too, they also gravitate towards a higher drive, higher impact. I mean, it's kind of a step up in the game as far as it goes, as to what you're going to experience, the amount of violence, the amount of access you have to dangerous people, the more intel you have, the more things that you're asked to do. This is when I started serving search warrants and the whole kicking doors and all that kind of things. And I was doing a lot of buy busts for our narcotics unit and serving search warrants. And again, it was just an exposure early on to these super high end, super high drive dopamine, oxytocin types of things very early on as a police officer.
Paint that picture a little bit more for people that are listening when you say, the high dopamine and all that. Like, what were the situations that you were in? Can you kind of make us almost be there with you and go back in time a little bit and tell us about, can you tell us? I don't know if you can, but can you tell us
Yeah,
some of
yeah,
that?
yeah. I mean, I don't even have to say names, but
Yeah.
it essentially, I mean, when you're messing with a lot of these types of people, there's a lot of gunplay involved and things of that nature. So when you do go to make these stops, it's kind of like they talk about it in football. It's kind of like that CTE. It's like that sudden blast of brain chemicals. I mean, when you're driving and you're knowing that this car in front of you probably contains, or you will know, as a matter of fact, that the person in front of you, this car contains a super violent person with a violent history that's probably not going to want to go back to prison.
Hmm.
So when you turn the lights on, a lot of times the cars will either take off, or it's not uncommon for doors to fly open. And then you're in this foot pursuit chasing these people,
Right.
and they're trying to get away, and they're armed and you're armed, and it's a super high intensity environment. Your brain, dopamine comes on so many different levels. A lot of people just don't realize it. Like, you can get it from petting your dog or seeing your cat, or you can get these ultra levels of dopamine from doing these super dangerous things and these foot pursuits and car chases and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I can't even imagine, because I'm sure as soon as you spotted a car with your photographic memory, you probably recognized a car, you recognized a license plate, and then immediately your body was like, here we go, right? And then,
Yes, correct.
yeah, and then you're out of the car, and like you're saying, you're either on foot or you're chasing them in the car, and I'm sure your heart's just racing because you don't know what's about to happen after that, and it's this
Correct.
constant fight or flight, right?
Every day.
Every single day.
Yes.
Did you recognize that early on, like, whoa, I am high, I am low, I am high? Were you recognizing that fluctuation?
Correct. Yeah, I think I did. And I eventually learned how to operate in that area, but I mean, that would come over time and over repeated exposure and things of that nature. But early on, it was pretty draining just because your body's not used to it and you're not used to being able to work in that high level of fight or flight inside of your brain. But it's something that you adapt to over time.
So talk about that because you were telling me how you adapted your body essentially, or your brain rewired to have a new level, right? So go ahead and tell us a little bit about that.
So yeah, so I did that for a couple years, and then I would come to work, and then eventually an opportunity would open up in our undercover narcotics unit, which was clearly my dream job at the time. But if you don't understand that job at all, it is absolutely mentally draining. A lot of places have term limits on that so that you're not basically putting yourself in that environment for so long
Hmm.
because there's nothing like it. You can't imagine purchasing narcotics like in an undercover fashion from people you don't even know. I would become a monster. I could buy anything you could ever imagine in your life at these unbelievable quantities.
Hmm.
And it just provides a brain chemical and a dopamine like you just cannot believe. Walking across parking lots with thousands and thousands of dollars, brokering deals. That world, people think of jobs as a 9 to 5, but when you work that job, it's 24/7. And there was weeks we would work 100 hours and
Wow.
things of that nature, and it goes home with you. It's in your car with you. I mean, I remember being in school lines, dropping my kids off, ordering drugs. It was crazy. It just it provides so much brain stimulation and things of that nature that real life just can't provide it. So go
Well,
ahead.
yeah, no, I can hear that because I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, okay, so you've got the stimulation of you're holding all this money in this parking lot. Most people don't ever hold that much money in their hands in cash, right? Like we have our money in our
Correct.
bank accounts, but people don't just walk around with loads of cash in their hands. So even that alone, I feel like can rush somebody. But what you're saying is so much more than that. You're holding all this money and then you're putting yourself in this situation where, oh my gosh, if they happen to know, right? Because you probably thought that too sometimes, right?
Correct.
Like if they happen to
Absolutely.
know that I'm a cop, like this is
Correct.
going real sideways. And so, like, I can't even imagine because I'm thinking, like, gosh, your brain was probably like, I got to be prepared to protect myself if this goes wrong, but also I have to remember the script that I have to be saying because I'm not a cop right now. I'm buying drugs or selling drugs or whatever you were doing, like
Correct.
it's
You have
it's
to be able to think incredibly fast and incredibly clear. You have to be
yeah.
able to think, work, move. It is quite a whale of a job.
Mm, yeah.
So I would go on to seize millions and millions of dollars in US currency and narcotics along the way. But about the 10-year mark of doing this, I started to realize that I was having some problems. I had to start sleeping downstairs, like I wasn't sleeping right. Things were kind of going sideways. I can vividly remember one instance where like my daughter, she was super young at the time, and I was reading her a book, and I can remember hearing my work phone go off, and we had just started reading this book. And I told her, okay, I'd bend the page over and tell her, okay, like we'll start again here tomorrow. And she couldn't believe that we were already done reading this book because I knew I had to get to my work phone. And I could just realize like at home, I wasn't happy anymore. I wasn't happy in essentially in my marriage. I
Mhm.
wasn't happy with that. Well, the problem came through something that I didn't know about. And what had happened over time, what you were respecting or talking about earlier, is the fact is this is only one of the real terms that I use that I know about. The rest of them are all slang terms, but neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change how it functions, basically subliminally without your knowing or without you being able to control it. So essentially, over time, I didn't even realize what had happened, but through this magic of something called neuroplasticity, and I would learn this later. I didn't even know this at this time, but I had done so many high end, so many dangerous things at this point that I had essentially rewired my brain subconsciously. And I did not know that till when it would produce the reward chemicals.
Mhm.
Analogy that I use a lot of times is like when people are driving in a car and you're in like a wooded area, there's a whole bunch of people in the car, and all of a sudden a deer jumps out and you swerve and your car goes crazy and everybody spins and people are putting their hands and bracing and this, and the deer takes off and you straighten the car out. Everybody has the exact reaction that you have right now, right? In the
Yeah.
car, everybody's face, you're smiling. Everybody's like, holy cow, what just happened? that was crazy. But
Yeah.
inevitably, somebody in the car will always go, that was crazy, but let's not do that again. My brain knew we could do that again. And that would become the baseline for my real life. And real life at that point would no longer be capable for me, right?
Okay.
Normal everyday life could not get my brain to provide the brain chemicals that you need.
Yeah. No stimulation,
Yeah,
right?
correct. That stimulation, it wasn't high enough. I had done so many things through neuroplasticity that essentially just rewired when the reward system in my brain would work.
Mhm.
So I thought at this point in time, this is 15 years into my career, that if I left narcotics and I went back to the street, it was a big shocker. I had a lot of people call me when I walked away from that, just because I was at the top of my game at that point, right? I mean, everybody looked at all this crazy stuff I was doing and all of these incredible work and drug cases that I was a part of and doing. And people just couldn't believe that I'd walk away from it. But I was holding all this internally too. I hadn't really expressed to anybody anything about any of this stuff at this point because I didn't know a lot. So I would return to patrol in 2018, I believe it was. And because I thought I could live a normal life, I thought if I just went back, I'd just go live a normal life. But the damage was done at that point. There was nothing I could do about it because I had rewired my brain and I had no clue of what was going on. But in a crazy twist of fate, in 2018, we would have an incredible amount of violence, gang violence, that be it, in 2018. So my department, as usually it has happened to me multiple times, has called on me and offered me the opportunity to return back to the gang unit. They would give me an amazing 5 foot tall blonde partner, and her and I would hit the streets and absolutely wage war on our community. It was absolutely incredible. We were getting guns and drugs every night, car chases, foot chases. Because again, I still had all of this memory, right? I had all of these names. I had this massive Rolodex now. We're 15 years into my career, and I had been doing this for so long, right? It didn't matter. We live in a twin city. We were all over the place. It was crazy. I have so many wild stories that came from it.
What's your wildest story?
So in that time, I'll tell you one of them. I have two of them that I use in public speaking, and people have heard these stories before. So one night, I'm actually supposed to go to Punta Cana the next day with my wife. Some people at my work are getting married, some coworkers, a bunch of people had already flown out. My partner was not with me at this night. I was at home, essentially talking to my wife, getting ready to leave the next morning. I was just going to chill, hanging out by myself, and a call would come out at a neighboring apartment complex. Not even really a bad one either. So at that time frame, what came out and the call was dispatched was only one call would be put out, and it was a possible fight in the hallway and maybe a gunshot was the call. So I'm kind of sitting here because I don't know if anybody knows in your audience about policing. Most of the time when shots are fired, the 911 dispatch center explodes. Everybody and their brother, right? It has access to a cell phone nowadays. That's not uncommon.
Yeah.
No one, there would only be one caller. So I thought I'd be a good guy and I would go over there and help them out because they were pretty busy on 3 to 11. This is about 9 o'clock at night in April of 2018. So I would drive to this location. I would park my car. I would get out, start to walk towards the building. It's dark out. It's kind of rainy. And the front door has one of those glass panes that you can see through and a lighted foyer. There's also a stairwell that goes upstairs, 4 apartments upstairs, 4 apartments downstairs. So when I get to the door, I can see through the glass and there are 2 males face down on the floor. And I open the door and I'm blasted immediately with the smell of burnt gunpowder, and there's gun smoke from floor to the ceiling. I walk over to these 2 young kids and I flip them over. Their eyes are open. We're just looking at each other. I talk about that too. You could clearly tell that they were lifeless. They were no longer alive.
Yeah.
And then as I look down, I can see that there are drugs all over the foyer, and I'm literally standing in a sea of rifle casings.
Oh
Most
my gosh.
people will probably understand. This happened within, I'm talking, 5 seconds out of getting out of my car. Like, this is what I'm talking about, like being able to process stuff so quickly, being able to move and think, because my vest or a standard vest is no match for a rifle at all. And my pistol is no match for a rifle. So what I did was I quickly exited, went to my squad car, retrieved my rifle, and then went on the offense going back inside the building. I walked past those kids. I cleared the bottom floor. And of course, everybody is coming at this point, but still, you're just moving through this building where you have no idea what happened or who these people were. So then I make my way towards the stairs and I can start to see bullet holes in the handrails. And I feel this crazy, like cold breeze. And I turn around and I look behind me, and the window behind me as I going up the stairs to the second floor was blown out. And then I can see there's shell casings on the floor upstairs and shell casings halfway down the hallway. So you know that this started upstairs. I just didn't know exactly what apartment it was in. So what I did was I made myself as small as possible and laid on the floor to get myself as small as possible, because I knew if this person came out of one of these two apartments, I would easily see the door open up. They would probably present what the rifle that they had, and I was in a great position. It ended up, we figured out where they were, and it ended up being a 17-year-old young man. And it was basically a robbery gone bad is what it was.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So I watched your video. So then how did this one end? This one was not ending in a car chase?
This did not end in a car chase. So what happened was he was in his apartment and he eventually surrendered and he came out and he was taken into custody.
Okay. I watched one on your video. Didn't you have to like chase somebody or
So
well, I'm sure you've
yes.
chased somebody so many times, right?
So what you're referring to is, it was another pretty high profile case. It was all over the papers. There was a bunch of news articles about it. So essentially what it was again, like I told you about working in the gang unit, you have so much intel, and we had developed a high value target throughout that summer. Me and my partner, the same girl that I was talking about earlier, she's pretty tech savvy. And we had open source communication. Basically, it's things that the public can use. So we could track people using open source. I won't say the platform, but people can probably figure it out through location services. There's a lot of different platforms out there nowadays that you can use. So what that was essentially was we went to our inner city football game. And while we were there, we would spot this individual with 3 other known gang members at this football game. They would eventually leave the football game. We would follow them out across the parking lot to a Saturn. But the key here with this Saturn is the whole driver's side of the car is smashed in. So they have to get in and out the passenger side of the car. The driver has to get in, crawl over the center console to get in the seat. So we would get behind this vehicle that night, and I would try to stop it, but I could not get probable cause. They were just staying in the same lane, driving south for a very long time. So I peeled and went back to town. A couple of days later, I see that same car and I'm able to get it stopped. And I also have our canine with us at this point. So I'd asked the young man that was in the car that we were after to get out because I was going to run a dog. And he said, don't even worry about it, because if I had what you were looking for, I would have never stopped this car. So clearly the car was clean that night. So what you're referring to is this news article that would come out later. Approximately 2 weeks later, I'm with my partner. We are out and about. Same platform. We figure out that he's out on the move. He's moving guns and drugs. These are very ultra violent people regarding this traffic stop. So the deal here is you probably know, we've talked a little bit about the brain. These are very young kids. So the problem with that is essentially with the same story that I just told before, is their frontal lobe is not formed, which is responsible for impulse control and decision making. So if you add in guns, drugs, gangs, and that brain chemistry, and the fact that they've already been exposed to violence, it is a horrific position to be put in. These kids are ultra violent. So we would eventually find the Saturn that I just told you about. We waited down the block. The Saturn would pull out onto the street. It would go south in our town without a turn signal, and that was all I needed to make the stop. But I would pull up behind the Saturn before I could even get the lights off. He was 100 miles an hour. I think the news article was, man arrested for armed violence after 100-mile-per-hour pursuit. I never did chase the car that night. He was flying into oncoming traffic. It was insane. I never even got the lights turned on. But I continued south because a lot of times the crash with my partner while we were driving, my partner would eventually, again, through open source intelligence, we would figure out that he went home. But again, I wasn't too concerned about it, because usually what happens is they go home, everybody gets out of the car, they go inside an apartment complex, and they just never answer the door. There's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
So I asked her what she wanted to do, and she was game. She was ready to go. So I said, all right, we'll make a run at it. So we went down to where this car would be at. So to get to this car, you have to drive down a super long, dark alley. This is in pitch black in the middle of the night. So I kill the lights on our squad cars. We're going down this long alley, and there's a privacy fence that goes straight ahead and then cuts back and makes an S. So as we're rolling and I start to get towards that S where it cuts back, I can see the front of the Saturn. So I know the car is there. But
Mm-hmm.
as we roll past the Saturn, I realize every person is still in the car,
Oh man.
right? This is a terrible spot to be in. So as soon as they realize that the squad car they had just ran from
Yeah.
just passed them, they all frantically wanted out of that car. But as I told you earlier, the driver's side is smashed in. So it was very hard for everybody to get out of the car, which allowed
Mhm.
me to put our car in park. These are those decisions that we just talked about.
Yeah.
When I talk about working undercover and things of that nature, you have to be able to process this so fast and be able to move because the level of intensity in the brain chemicals that are being dropped on you at this point,
Yeah.
you have to be able to fight through that and work. So I would literally throw the car in park. Two of them would go behind a conversion van that I used to block it, and then I would cross the front of the Saturn and stop two there, and then my partner would stop the other two, and we got all four of them.
Oh my gosh. Wow. No, you're right. I mean, it's definitely a special skill or special brain to be able to function at that speed so rapidly where you're taking on all the chemicals, but also having all the responses that you need. That's definitely a skill.
Right. These are people don't understand. They're crazy stories, but when you're there, these are life and death experiences. Like you have to be able to process and move absolutely quickly and seamlessly to control these situations. Because I testified, I think they put it in the paper here. There was 2-on-4 in a back alley in Bloomington. Easter testified. If you look in the paper on this article when they talk about it, like we were in a terrible situation as far as that goes. I just assumed their car would be empty, and I guess that's one of those things. Again, that's like I talked about that CET thing where it just blasts you so
Mhm.
fast.
Yeah.
So those are two of the crazier stories in 18. And here's another thing that a lot of people don't think about is actually for this in 2018 for what her and I did, it was absolutely incredible. I would win the first ever Normal Police Department Police Officer of the Year award. They created it that year and I won it. And our
Mhm.
chief at the time would reward me that for my tireless dedication to removing illegal guns and drugs from the streets of our community.
Yeah.
Right? Tireless dedication. That should tell you like what I had been up to for what 18, 15 years at that
Years.
point. It was almost nonstop.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for doing that. So you go through all of this up and down with your mental state, essentially, right? With this
Correct.
career. And then we get to this point where you just can't do it anymore. Tell us about what happens when you get to this point where you can't do it anymore. Like, how do you become aware that you're mentally done or to the point of needing help? And what kind of help do you get and how do you get better?
So what would happen after the 2018 is I would eventually take a temporary sergeant promotion. I would run our narcotics unit. I would do a lot more damage to compound all the damage that I had done in reference to, we talked about rewiring my
Mhm.
reward system. And then after that, I would essentially go back in January of 21, which is now the name of my company is the Fractured Mind. I'll never forget it. It was unbelievable. I literally went to bed in the middle of January and I would literally suffer a complete fracture of the mind. I woke up the next day and the thought of going to work as a police officer physically made me sick. I had no idea what I was going to do. I had no idea how I had gotten here.
Mhm.
Essentially, what had happened was I had done so much damage over time, and my brain had pushed out so much high level dopamine, and I had so much cortisol and adrenaline go through my body that I would essentially break my brain. And at one point, it just finally decided we are no longer going to do this. So you have two hemispheres of your brain, your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. My left side would essentially turn off and shut down. Said essentially it's self-preservation mode at that point
Right.
because my brain was just essentially just going to redline and just explode like a car engine, you know? So it literally would shut itself down in preservation. So my right side would try to operate and take over what the left side was doing. And when you have this chemical imbalance in your brain, it is absolutely detrimental to your mental health. It is absolutely crushing. So I didn't really know what I was going to do. And I think that this is really common in policing too. So this is 18 years into my career now. This is after 2 terms in a gang unit, 2 terms in a SWAT team, a decade undercover, a 6-month stint as a narcotics sergeant. Like it's just all super high drive policing.
Mhm.
So I was back on patrol essentially at this point, but I was still working 6P to 4A and I was kind of working alongside our gang unit at this point. I didn't know what to do. I knew I didn't want to go to work. So I would go to work And the first thing I did, it was a self-preservation mode again, like we talked about, was I had this massive amount of time off in my time off bank. I didn't count as staffing. I was working Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 10 hours a day. So that was a 40-hour week, Wednesday to Saturday. So the first thing that I did was I took every Saturday off. I needed this number to be monumentally smaller than 40 because there was no way I was going to do this job for 40 hours a week. 30 was 30 was attainable. And I was doing nothing at this work. I had shut down completely. I was doing no police work. I was literally just going to work and watching the time go by.
What
So
exactly, can we go back? But like, what
yeah,
exactly was it in your brain or your mind, your thought process? What was it that told you I am maxed out?
I don't really know. It was kind of a physical sensation when
Okay.
again, it was that night. I kind of, things started getting dark, like darkness, kind of like a depression was definitely moving in, but my brain essentially was just turned off. And I think it was a deal where I knew that my brain was not going to work right at work, or it's just a physiological change. I don't really know. I think it got, and we'll talk about it. It more so gets worse. It was more a sense of awareness than anything early on that, okay, I don't want to do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do this.
You were feeling or viewing the world differently all of a sudden and you recognized
Absolutely.
it. Okay.
Yes. My brain was stuck in fight or flight and more stuck in flight than anything. I think that that was probably my right side was just completely stuck in fight or flight.
I'm just trying to make this relatable for people
Yeah.
or even like recognizable so that they can be like, oh, something isn't quite right. Like I need to maybe get my mental health on track. And I think what you're kind of saying,
Yeah.
you just start waking up and it's like the way you would think or process or get up and the emotions you would have were no longer what you were feeling every morning or just throughout the day. Like you just felt different inside.
For sure. And there was definitely a sense
Hmm.
of, I don't want to say scared, but very apprehensive about going to work. Like the drive was no longer there. My drive to do the work, there was the thought of doing that any longer was just gone. Everything had just my will to push forward. It was almost like you were just being pulled under, like carrying
Okay.
around a super anchor, right? Everything was just pressing against you,
Okay.
holding you back to a degree.
Yeah. Okay. So what did you end up doing then to help yourself?
So, like I talked about, the 40 hours was too much. So I took every Saturday off. And
Mhm.
eventually 40 or 30 became too many hours. So I went back to my calculator, back to the drawing board, and I had enough time to leave early every Friday. So I got it to 25 hours at night of working.
Mhm.
I was safe at home. The worst place for me to be was at work, like I said, because I wasn't doing anything. I had no desire to be there. The thought of even being there made me sick. My brain was broken. The amount of hopelessness you get when you don't get any brain reward chemicals every day. You know, tomorrow is going to be worse than today, and the next day is going to be worse than that. And the next day, the amount of hopelessness you have is unbelievable.
Mhm.
So, with that, I was working 25 hours a week. And as you can imagine, I was living on borrowed time. So, eventually, that 25 became too much. So, what I did in my mind was I told myself Friday was essentially a free day because I would go in, maybe go to lunch. Essentially, I would work from 6 to 11, go home, put my car away. It was a free day. So, I got it
Mhm.
to 20 hours. And then when 20 hours got to be too much on Wednesday and Thursday, I told myself the main problem is 11 at night till 4 in the morning, right? There isn't a car on the road Wednesday or Thursday. It's pitch black out. It's nothing but you and your brain trapped in the squad car. So I knew that it was 10 hours. I just told myself I needed to survive 10 hours a week. I'm just trying to get to where I could bid off of a shift, off of where I'm at to go to a normal shift to try to assimilate and live somewhat of a normal life. I didn't
Mhm.
realize that wasn't possible. My brain was not going to allow me to do that. But that's the perspective to stay alive at that point, right? You just have to,
Mhm.
I needed these small wins.
You were trying to
So,
remove yourself from the situation that was causing it in the first place.
correct.
Okay.
1,000%. That's it. That is apparently, I mean, it was through these wild perceptions in my brain that I was able to do that. Eventually, I found a lunch hour in there both days, and I got it from 10 to 8. And eventually, I told myself 3 at night till 4 in the morning is a chance to do reports, put the car away, put your gear away, and all those kind of things. So I got it down to literally 6 months in July of 21. Just survived 6 hours a week at work was the number that I had to make it so small to make it manageable. So the biggest twist of fate would come here shortly. So I got off of that shift. I went to afternoons, 3 to 11s. I think I had weekends off. I'm sure I got some dopamine. I'm sure I got some oxytocin when I got off of that shift because it was like, whew, I just survived the worst 6 months of my entire life. But I was still living on borrowed time, right? Nothing, I'd done nothing. I'd still never seen a therapist. And I'll give my job credit along the way too, because they actually pulled me off the street. I set off a whole bunch of warning alarms,
Okay.
EAP alarms. So clearly, I've always said that. Like there was clearly something in place that would identify a person at your employment that is deeply struggling. But you can lead a person to water, but you can't make them drink. They identified it. They threw all these opportunities out there. And I said, I just need some time. I was too scared to tell anybody what was going on because I didn't even know what was going on. I had no idea how I got there. I think that's one of the worst parts too, is I have a beautiful wife, 2 amazing kids. I have a very award-winning career. There's not a money issue at all. We have good jobs. I have a beautiful house. I have the perfect life. How am
Right.
I so broken? Right? It
Yeah.
makes no sense at all. I couldn't understand it. I had no idea how this had happened to me.
Mhm.
So once I got off that ship, I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know how my life was going to change, but that would all come about on August 30th of 21. This is a month after I switched shifts, and I was starting to fall after a month. Like it was going to wear off again, and I was just going to be living on borrowed time again. But I would be dispatched to a North Normal mobile home park for a shots fired call and a person shot. I would be the first person to arrive there. I would stage across the street at Casey's, but unfortunately, the situation would rapidly deteriorate into an active shooter situation. So at that point, I would pull into the trailer park, get out, and eventually start to play the most dangerous game of hide and seek humanly possible.
Oh, man.
2 other officers would arrive on scene with me. This gentleman was actively shooting people in this mobile home park when we arrived. We could hear the gunfire as we run towards it. So, one of the things that is absolutely crazy about this, though, is that when I got there and I find him and I realize how this incident is going to go, my brain actually turned on for the first time in 6 months because it was a high enough high drive event. My
Mhm.
brain just dropped so much dopamine and oxytocin, everything you can imagine in my brain. And that was the best I had felt in 6 months, was running to
Okay.
what could be the end of my life. So
Wow.
after a running gunfight through the mobile home park, it would end with me and the suspect at about 7 yards just exchanging gunfire to where I was finally able to put an end to it.
Oof. Okay. So what happened though mentally? Because you said, you cut back your shift so that you could kind of take a break from all this. But then what did you do to get your brain rewired essentially, right? Didn't you
So yes.
do that?
So this whole incident, afterwards, I do a whole bunch of other stuff. My body was actually at baseline through this whole entire incident. So it's just kind of a wild deal that I had to go through everything, break my brain, but yet it would also, all of that damage I did would be the detrimental part to push me through an incident such as that, because I was able to operate under that amount of stress because of what I did for myself before. But as what's required after an officer involved shooting, you're required to go to an EAP counselor, which is the Employee Assistance Program, right? You have to. And there's a company out there that talks about this. A lot of times, an officer involved shooting can be the best thing that ever happens to an officer. As terrible as it is, and I hope nobody ever has to go through it. And I have no desire to go through it again, but it forces you to a counselor, and everybody knows you should be talking to them. I knew it was a chance to get better. I
Mhm.
thought this is the perfect time for me to get better because I knew how broken I was. So they sent me to my first EAP counselor, and I think it was more of a single stage event counselor. And I would confess everything to this guy. I tell people and they always laugh. I think he needed a counselor after I told him how crazy my life had been. Right. And like he said, you can't go back to work for a long time. We need to find you a specialist.
Oh my
So
God.
that's what they did. And they sent me to a specialist, which was fine because I knew this was a chance to get better. Right. And then through talk therapy and EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing,
Mhm.
I would start to work through it. And the fact that I was so open and vulnerable with my essentially the therapist that would put me back together and save my life was the fact that he was able to figure all this stuff out. A lot of the stuff I've talked about, you have to understand, I didn't know at the time. I didn't know any of this until I was all figured out. The dopamine, the high drive, neuroplasticity, all those things were all uncovered through all of this, through talk therapy and essentially EMDR. But I do remember, so when I talk about EMDR, I know there's a whole bunch of different ones, but I did the tappers.
Mhm.
So the paddles, I didn't want to do the lights. I had no desire to do the lights. They do it with lights. And what it is for your listeners is it's bilateral stimulation. When I talked about earlier, the fact that the left side of my brain had turned off, they are trying to turn it back on. So you
Mhm.
hold these paddles and they buzz super hard, left, right, left, right, left, right, while you talk about all of these things. And
Mhm.
you go pretty deep and intense when you're talking about it because what they're trying to do is get your left side to produce those brain chemicals again, basically squeeze it like a sponge to get it out of there, to get it to work, to get your left side to talk to your right side again. And that's what exactly what happened. It's pretty miraculous. One of the neat things that I talk about early on was I was watching, I don't know why, but I decided during this time that I was going to watch Yellowstone for some odd reason. And there was a
Mhm.
couple pretty dark scenes while watching this show. And
Uh-huh.
I remember distinctly thinking, I do not like this. I could not believe, I couldn't stand how it felt. Right. It was like,
Mhm.
it made my stomach turn. And I would fast forward past a couple of these scenes. And I remember going back to therapy and talking about it, talking to my therapist at the time, again, after doing EMDR for a while. And he was like, that is absolutely incredible. I'm like, what do you mean that's incredible? That was terrifying. Right. And like he says, that is empathy. That's something you haven't had. That's a normal human
Yeah.
reaction. That's how a
New
normal
emotion.
human feels. Yes. So he's like, that's you becoming human again. That's your brain working the right way again. He's like, you should be so proud of yourself. He's like, that's absolutely incredible. And I think too early on, emotions were so big for me because I hadn't had them for so long. I mean, these feelings of empathy, a lot of people would be like, oh, man, I don't really like that. But I mean, they were like sickening. Like, they were just so big in the beginning because I hadn't had them. Then I just knew that I was getting better and I was all in at that point. It was off to the races at that point. And he would
Yeah.
rewire me and I would regain everything. And now I have this incredible story that I can tell people through my wild experiences. I've always tell people at least I have a sexy topic. It's guns, drugs, gangs, car chases, and an officer involved shooting.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. I think people might listen and think like, well, my life's not that crazy. And that's okay, right? I think the thing to take
Correct.
away is that the chemicals change in your body over time from the situations you've put yourself in, or even for people with childhood traumas that they've been through, they've had their levels changed because of these traumatic experiences. And so it's really important that we go back and change how we view these experiences or how we respond in times of crisis. And so I think it's still very valuable, even if somebody has not been chasing people with guns and drugs and all the things, it's still very valuable for people to learn that they are able to change their chemical responses in their body, because that's essentially what you're sharing with everyone, is that you have changed the way your body chemically responds. You changed it during your career, but then you changed it again to go back to more of a normal state. And I think that's really helpful.
Correct. So my company that I run now, when I talk about this and all of these things, is called the Fractured Mind. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but I also talk about it too, to the degree exactly what you're talking about. This is not just specifically for police officers. What I'm talking about here, I mean, it's for your entire audience because I mean, it comes down to even first responders. There's so many high pressure careers. I couldn't imagine being a doctor in the way
Right.
and a surgeon and all of these people. There's so many high pressure jobs. And even when it comes to policing, like we talked about, there's people that have done far more than me that might be perfectly fine. And there's people that I know have done far less than me that are not perfectly fine. It's
Right.
everybody's unique ability is completely different, right? And everybody's story in life is different. There's people, again, that have done so much more than me. There's people that have done a lot less than me. But in the end, we can all get to that same exact state just from a different point of view. It's no different than I talk about how we can all go to Walmart 10 different ways. You can all end up in the same place. You can super relate to where I've been and what I've been through. Your story can look completely different, but you can, like I tell people, it is possible to heal the fractures in your mind and reclaim your peace.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
So where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
So I do have through my LinkedIn a lot of times and through my website, thefracturedmind.com. It'll route you to that. I have an email on there that I use that people can get a hold of me through. That is probably the easiest way. Thefracturedmind7309 at gmail.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here. And for anybody watching, if you want to connect with Evan, please reach out to him. And if you like this episode, make sure you subscribe so that you can catch all the future episodes, because everybody's got a different story and a different method. And I think Evan would agree with me. We can all accept the fact that we're all going to heal a little bit differently. And so what's worked for Evan probably works great for a lot of people, but there might be a different method. And stay tuned for future episodes with other ways of gaining that mental health that we all need to have.